The heroes have just figured out that Old Tom the Lighthouse Keeper is the mysterious serial killer they've been tracking. Everything is ready for the final confrontation, for the big showdown between the PCs and the demon ghost which has been plaguing Moorville. And that's when the players call the cops. Because of course they do. What would you do if you had evidence identifying a murderer? You'd call the cops. In our last video, we talked about what happens when the players call an uber-powerful NPC like Elminster or Odin or the president of the Galactic Federation to solve all their problems for them. NPCs that logically should want to help them with their current situation, but whose involvement would sideline the PCs and maybe even remove them from the scenario entirely. Now today we're going to talk about a very similar problem. What happens when the PCs, confronted with some horrible crime or circumstance, do the logical thing and report it to the proper authorities? For example, the police, or the CIA, or the army. The big, organized forces of little guys who enforce civilization. Now, many of the techniques from the previous video will also work for this situation, and vice versa. But in practice, they're different enough to pose unique challenges. For example, while it's relatively easy to explain why Elminster is busy and can't help right now, it's more difficult to explain why the entire police department would be so preoccupied that none of them can respond to a crisis. Now, in my experience, calling in the little guys also tends to be more disruptive than calling in a big gun. I think this is because most RPGs are structured around small bands of extraordinary heroes. Whereas the big guns tend to work in the same paradigm, the inclusion of Big Brother seems to simply drown the PCs out. To mix my metaphors, the PCs end up being a fish out of water. Now this assumes that it's the players who are deciding to reach out to the NPCs. Oddly, if the situation is reversed and it's the game master who's pushing the NPCs into the scenario, I find that the exact opposite is true. Big guns become far more disruptive and the little guys are manageable. I suspect this is for the exact same reason. The big gun operates in the same paradigm as the PCs, so when the Game Master tries to shove them down the players' throats, it feels as if the PCs are just being replaced by a newer, shinier model that they don't get to play. Whereas when the little guys show up uninvited, they tend to be interpreted as simply another obstacle that our strong, independent heroes need to figure out a way to overcome. But I digress. The PCs have picked up the phone and called the cops. What happens next? Option 1, they don't believe them. Now this solution can be basically a genre convention for any modern campaign featuring the paranormal. Think of shows like Buffy the Vampire Slayer or Supernatural. If you go to the cops babbling about werewolves, they aren't going to believe you. They'll probably just end up making the problem worse. You can even use this paradigm in campaigns where the PCs are the authority. In fact, if you frame it correctly, it can let the PCs both simultaneously belong to a government agency and be a small band of extraordinary heroes. Think of the X-Files or Delta Green, for example. But this conceit doesn't require the supernatural either. Think about the beginning of Die Hard, where John McClane is continually trying to convince the LAPD that the terrorist threat is real, but they keep dismissing him as a kook or a prank caller. And even when they do show up, they just make things worse. On that note, option 2, lost in bureaucracy. The PCs detect an oncoming crisis, warn the appropriate authorities, and nothing. The authorities don't do anything. Or they do something, but it's misguided and doesn't actually solve the problem. Or there's a committee that's going to figure out what the proper course of action is, but it's clear that by the time they're done deliberating, the asteroid will have already obliterated Venice, or whatever the crisis happens to be. I mean, look no further than restraining orders that take 3 weeks to process when the guy bought a gun yesterday, the government response to the climate crisis, or the clusterfuck pandemic response we've seen literally everywhere except Taiwan and New Zealand for the past 2 years. You can also send a strong signal early in a campaign that the little guys aren't going to help the PCs by sending the incompetent bureaucracy looking for them first. Think about Walter Peck, the abusive EPA rep in the original Ghostbusters film, for example. On a similar note, option 3, the bad guys are connected. Coming back to Die Hard, do you remember the scene where McClane is celebrating because he can see the cop cars and fire engines coming down the boulevard, but then the bad guys call it as a false alarm and the firemen flip off their sirens, turn around, and leave? Now, this technique covers any number of possibilities for how the bad guys can counter the PCs notifying the authorities. Like the horror and suspense movies where the heroes see something suspicious and call the cops, but by the time the cops show up, the bad guys have had a chance to make everything look normal. And maybe even more insidious than that, with the bad guys having already infiltrated the little guys. That might just be a few crooked cops, so you don't know who to trust, or it could be a conspiracy that secretly controls the entire local government, or an invasion of body snatchers that has the same effect. Option 4. They defer to the PCs. In this scenario, the little guys recognize that the PCs are the most qualified, the most skilled, and or have the most insight into what's happening. They'll either partner up with the PCs or simply put resources and manpower at their disposal. One variant of this that can work particularly well is for each PC to be put in command of a squad of NPCs. You can let the players run the whole squad, or if the squad's split up to pursue multiple objectives, you can use troop-style play, in which all the other players take on the role of an NPC in the current PC squad to keep everyone engaged in every scene. But what really makes this technique work is to actually put the players in charge. Give them access to the resources, but let them figure out how they want to utilize them. This can be a fine line to walk if you want to make sure that it doesn't permanently transform the campaign. But it's usually not too difficult to justify why this is a temporary circumstance that only applies to the immediate situation. Although maybe permanently shifting the campaign is exactly the right way to go. This video and other Alexandrian videos like it are made possible by my patrons at Patreon. If you'd like to support future videos, please click the link in the font of all knowledge down below. If you just want to watch more videos like this, there's a subscribe button down there too. Good gaming. This is Justin Alexander, and I'll see you at the table.